Every camera in the world is pointed at the waterline. The fast attack boats, the tanker smokestacks, the A-10 Warthog drilling holes in Iranian rudders with a 20mm cannon, the blockade intercepting ships, the ceasefire on 1% life support, the Carr Island satellite imagery showing oil slicks spreading across dark water. All of that is the visible surface of a conflict whose most dangerous next escalation is happening underneath the surface entirely. Literally, 7 fiber optic cables run along the floor of the Strait of Hormuz, 7 cables carrying the digital spine of the global financial system, Google traffic, Microsoft cloud infrastructure, Meta data flows, Amazon commercial processing, more than $10 trillion in financial transactions every single day, routing through the same seabed that Iran Ghadir-class mini-submarines are currently operating in, the same seabed that the IRGC has been mapping, mining, and surveilling as its last remaining operational domain after 92% of its surface naval fleet was destroyed. Its Navy commander was killed in a precision strike on a hidden underground bunker, and its drone and missile launch rates were reduced by 90%. And just last week, Iran military spokesperson declared publicly on social media, "We will impose fees on internet cables," not as a vague diplomatic threat, as an announced operational doctrine shift. State-linked media went further, suggesting that cable companies refusing to comply could face direct or indirect damage, pay up or go dark. That is not a press release. That is a mafia boss announcing his next revenue stream after his previous revenue streams were cut off by a naval blockade that zeroed $500 million per day of Iranian oil income. The Strait of Hormuz was Iran's oil weapon. The shipping lanes were Iran leverage. And now the IRGC is looking at the 7 fiber optic cables on the seabed floor of the same strait the way it looked at the shipping lanes in February of this year, like a piece of leverage it did not know it had until it ran out of all the leverage it thought it had. And while every expert analysis of this conflict is focused on the visible military campaign, the cables on the seabed floor are the next escalation domain that nobody is talking about.
And that could make every other dimension of this conflict look manageable by comparison, because cutting an oil tanker rudder with a cannon costs 20mm rounds. Cutting a fiber optic cable carrying $10 trillion of daily financial transactions costs a dive bag and a pair of cable cutters. And the Ghadir-class mini-marine, designed in North Korea and operated in the shallow warm waters of the Persian Gulf, is the specific instrument that makes that operation available to an IRGC that has been systematically deprived of every other instrument it spent 40 years building. Let me set the scene with the operational precision this threat demands, because on May 19, 2026, the strategic picture has just shifted in a way that the cable threat announcement makes comprehensible. Trump posted on Truth Social this morning that he had been asked by the Emir of Qatar, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and the President of the UAE to hold off on the planned military attack against Iran that was scheduled for today. His exact words, "Serious negotiations are now taking place, and in their opinion as great leaders and allies, a deal will be made which will be very acceptable
to the United States of America as well as the countries in the Middle East and beyond." And then the critical addition. The deal will include, importantly, no nuclear weapons for Iran. And then the qualification, whose weight the entire analysis of this conflict has been building toward. The U.S. military is locked and loaded should those talks break down. Locked and loaded. Not repositioning, not standing down, locked and loaded. The strikes that were planned for today have been delayed by 48 to 72 hours at the request of the same Gulf state leaders who have been absorbed in Iranian missile and drone attacks, including the strike on the Baraka nuclear power plant throughout the ceasefire period. 3 of the most consequential leaders in the Gulf calling on Trump personally to pause so that serious negotiations can proceed is not the same as the previous ceasefire extensions that produced diplomatic theater with substantive movement on the nuclear question. It is the Gulf states telling Trump that they believe something different is available now, that the internal Iranian political dynamics and the material pressure of the blockade have produced a moment
where a deal with the required nuclear provisions is achievable if the attack does not precede the negotiating conclusion. Whether they are right is the question whose answer the next 48 hours will produce. The U.S. military is locked and loaded. The cables are on the seabed. The Ghadir-class submarines are somewhere in the shallow, warm waters of the strait. And the world's most consequential 21 miles of water is simultaneously the most watched and the least understood strategic space on the planet. Now, let me take you under the water, because the Ghadir-class submarine is the weapon that nobody is adequately briefing the public on. And that is the specific instrument through which the cable threat moves from an announced extortion demand to an execution executable operation. The Gatadair class is a diesel-electric submarine, 95 feet long, 2.75 meters of beam displacing 117 tons surfaced and 125 tons submerged. A crew of 7, developed from North Korean Yugo-class and Yano-class designs that Iran acquired from Pyongyang in the early 2000s and then indigenously reproduced. Before this conflict began, Iran had somewhere between 16 and 23 of these submarines.
American operational assessments suggest approximately a dozen have been lost during the 2026 operations, which still leaves roughly 10 operational Gattier boats at the conservative end of the estimate, all of them assigned to the Southern Fleet at Bandar Abbas, 5 minutes of transit time from the Strait of Hormuz. These numbers matter because they represent the residual asymmetric naval capability that survived 92% surface fleet destruction and the assassination of the IRGC Navy commander. The Gattier class is what is left after the rest was eliminated, and in the specific operational environment of the Strait of Hormuz, its limitations are simultaneously its advantages. The strait is between 30 and 60 meters deep across most of its operational area. That shallow profile is exactly where the Gattier's capabilities are optimized. Modern large nuclear submarines are designed for deep water operations, where their sensor systems and weapons employment are calibrated for the acoustic environment of ocean-depth oceans. The Gattier in shallow Persian Gulf water is operating in an environment where its noise profile is partially masked by the acoustic
Clutter of shipping traffic, thermal layering effects, and the specific ambient noise of one of the world's busiest commercial waterways. It is not invisible, but it is harder to track than its technical specifications suggest because the tracking technology that makes large, deep-water submarines findable is less effective in the specific acoustic environment where the Gattier operates. The weapons loadout tells you exactly what an operational Gattier can do to the cables and to the commercial traffic above them. 2 533mm torpedo tubes capable of firing the Vol fighter torpedo, a weapon that travels on a supercavitation bubble of air at speeds that make evasion at close range effectively impossible. The Gattier has also been tested with the Yask-2 underwater-fired anti-ship cruise missile with a claimed range of 100 nautical miles that may exceed its verified capability, but whose employment against large, slow-moving commercial vessels
in the confined waters of the strait represents a genuine threat at shorter ranges where the range claim is credible. It can lay mines during transit, adding to the already significant mine threat that American mine countermeasure vessels have been working to neutralize since April 13th. And it can deploy combat divers, IRGC Navy Special Operations personnel, whose operational mission could include the specific cable-cutting task that the military spokesperson's social media announcement is describing. This is not a theoretical capability that requires sophisticated underwater engineering. Cable cutting by combat divers is an operation that can be executed with equipment that fits in a diving bag, at depths that combat swimmer-qualified personnel routinely operate in. Water conditions that the specific section of the Strait of Hormuz where the cables run present no extraordinary obstacle to. Former Iranian Navy commander Rear Admiral Hussein Kazadi described the Gattier as capable of doing what the U-boat did in World War II. That is rhetorical framing. The accurate framing is that 7 crew members in a 95-foot diesel-electric submarine with combat diver capability can cut a fiber optic cable carrying $10 trillion of daily financial transactions in a night dive operation, whose entire equipment requirement fits in the type of bag you could carry on an airline flight. Royal Navy Commander Ryan Ramsey, who captained the nuclear submarine HMS Turbulent in the Persian Gulf, described the Gattier honestly and without dismissiveness. Tiny submarines, but enough torpedoes to sink a couple of ships, and enough combat diver capacity to sever the cables that carry Google traffic, Microsoft Cloud operations, Meta social infrastructure, and Amazon commercial processing through the same seabed floor where the submarine is currently operating. The cable threat announcement did not come from nowhere. It is the IRGC recognition of the specific strategic position
it occupies after the surface and air dimensions of its deterrence architecture have been systematically eliminated. The surface fleet is 92% gone. The drone and missile launch rates are reduced by 90%. The Navy commander is dead. The oil revenue is zeroed. The storage tanks are filling toward overflow. The payroll reserve is drawing down. The proxy network is being financially starved. The information monopoly has cracked.
and the remaining Gadiar submarines are the one operational asset whose depth and acoustic profile give them survival prospects in a strait where American P-8 Poseidon patrol aircraft, MH-60R Seahawk helicopters, and the Lockheed Martin Lamprey autonomous undersea vehicle have been building a targeting picture of every subsurface contact since the campaign began. The IRGC has identified what it has left,
And what it has left is the ability to operate in the specific acoustic environment where the cables are, with the specific crew capability to interact with those cables manually, in a way that the spectacular kinetic operations of carrier strike groups and strategic bombers and precision air-to-ground missiles cannot address with the same efficiency that those systems apply to surface and air threats. This is the institutional logic of the cable threat announcement. We have been stripped of everything except the submarine. The submarine can reach the cables. The cables carry more financial value per day than our entire oil revenue before the blockade began. Therefore, the cable is the new Strait of Hormuz leverage. Pay the fees or we cut the infrastructure. It is the same extortion logic that made the shipping lane closure the initial weapon, translated into the one remaining domain where the IRGC has operational access. The 10 trillion daily transaction figure that the IRGC-linked Tasnim news agency put in its analysis is the number that makes the cable threat strategically significant rather than merely provocative. 10 trillion per day. The Strait of Hormuz carries approximately 20% of the world's seaborne oil trade. That is an enormous economic flow. But in the contemporary global financial system, the digital transaction flows that move through undersea fiber optic cables dwarf the physical commodity flows that move through the surface waterways above them. A disruption to oil shipping through the Strait of Hormuz is an energy market crisis. A disruption to the fiber optic cables carrying $10 trillion of daily financial transactions is a global financial system crisis of a categorically different magnitude. Bank settlement systems, cross-border payment networks, cloud computing infrastructure
that supports everything from hospital records to air traffic control, to the specific automated trading systems through which modern financial markets function. None of these are independently resilient to the loss of the cable infrastructure that the Gardier combat divers could theoretically sever, and the specific companies named in the IRGC's calculus, Google, Microsoft, Meta, Amazon, are not passive observers of threats to the infrastructure they depend on. They are organizations with the financial resources, the political relationships, and the institutional urgency to move outcomes at a pace that government bureaucracies rarely achieve. When the IRGC says the cable companies refusing to comply could face direct or indirect damage, it is simultaneously making a threat to the infrastructure and identifying the constituency whose response to that threat might produce political outcomes faster than the military and diplomatic processes currently managing the conflict. Now, let me describe the American counter-architecture that is being deployed against the gutter threat. Because the United States military's undersea capability in this theater is the dimension of the conflict that has received the least public coverage relative to its operational significance, and the specific systems being deployed represent the next generation of autonomous undersea warfare that the shallow water mini-marine threat has been accelerating the development and deployment of. Layer 1 is the P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, a modified Boeing 737 converted into a flying sensor array with sonoys, magnetic anomaly detection equipment, surface search radars, signals intelligence collection systems, and the specific acoustic processing upgrades that are optimized for tracking diesel-electric submarines
in the shallow, warm water, acoustic environment of the Persian Gulf. The P-8 is not just a patrol aircraft that happens to be present in the theater. It was developed with the specific threat profile of North Korean and Iranian mini-submarines as a primary design requirement, because the acoustic challenges of tracking small diesel-electric submarines in shallow, cluttered water are fundamentally different from the open ocean tracking problems that previous generations of maritime patrol aircraft were optimized for.
Confirmed reports have P-8 Poseidons conducting operations in and around Bondara Bars and Kesham Island, building the acoustic picture of every subsurface contact in the operational area, creating the baseline data that allows any anomalous movement to be detected against the established pattern. Every Gadia submarine whose acoustic signature has been logged by P-8 sonobuoy passes is a Gadia submarine that can be tracked when it moves from its berth towards the cable routes. Layer 2 is the MH-60R Seahawk helicopter operating from Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and the carrier air wings.
The Romeo variant carries dipping sonar that can be lowered directly into the water column above a suspected submarine contact, the specific sensing geometry that provides the most direct acoustic characterization of a submarine in shallow water where the SOI network's coverage gaps can allow a contact to be temporarily lost, combined with air-launched Mark 54 lightweight torpedoes whose guidance systems are specifically calibrated for shallow water engagements. The MH-60R is the weapon system that converts the P-8 Poseidon's detection into a weapons delivery solution. The P-8 finds the contact, the MH-60R prosecutes it. Together they form a targeting chain that addresses the specific operational challenge of tracking and engaging a small shallow-running diesel-electric submarine in acoustically cluttered Persian Gulf water. This targeting chain has already been applied at least once in this conflict. CENTCOM confirmed that ATACMS missiles sank an Iranian submarine earlier in the campaign. The fact that land-based ballistic missiles were applied to the submarine problem rather than the P-8 and MH-60R targeting chain suggests that the submarine in question was operating in an environment
where surface detection had provided the location confidence that land-based precision fires could exploit. The Gadia submarines that remain operational have presumably absorbed the lesson out operating in environments where surface detection is more likely and are adjusting their operational patterns accordingly, which is exactly where Layer 3 becomes the decisive capability. The Lockheed Martin Lamprey is the autonomous undersea vehicle that was unveiled in February 2026, 6 weeks before this conflict began, and that represents the next-generation answer to the shallow water mini-submarine problem that the P-8 and MH-60R targeting chain addresses but cannot fully solve in the specific acoustic environment of a submarine operating against critical seabed infrastructure. The Lamprey is an extra-large, uncrewed undersea vehicle with no large propeller signature, using instead a tapered hull with soft-vectored thrust that is acoustically designed to disappear in the shallow water environment that the Persian Gulf presents. This is not incidental to its design. It is the specific acoustic profile management that allows the Lamprey to operate in the same
water column as the Gadia without generating the detection signatures that the Gadia-owned sensors would register as a threat. The Lamprey can locate a Gadia submarine from extended range. It can track it through its operational patterns. It can follow it back to the hardened underwater facilities where the IRGC has been basing and concealing its remaining submarine assets. And it can pass that location information to the F-35s and F-15E overhead, whose JDAM guidance systems and 5,000-pound bunker-buster bombs convert the Lamprey's intelligence into the kinetic outcome that the targeting chain was built to produce. The Lamprey is the leech that latches on and does not let go, not because it has weapons, because it has persistence and silence that the Gadia's acoustic sensors cannot detect. Meaning the Gadia cannot perform the evasive maneuver that would deny the targeting chain the location confidence it needs. The Gadia's operational signature significantly noisier than modern submarines.
Limited crew experience in sustained submerged operations restricted to the shallow, warm water environment where the Lamprey is specifically designed to dominate makes the acoustic contest between these two systems one whose outcome the technical specifications favor overwhelmingly in the Lamprey's direction. The DARPA Manta Ray completes the undersea intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance architecture with the specific capability of sustained seabed-level monitoring that the Lamprey and the P-8 approach from above cannot provide with equivalent persistence. The Manta Ray is an unmanned undersea vehicle designed for long-duration autonomous missions without the logistic support requirements that crewed or conventionally powered autonomous systems require. Operating at seabed level in the specific corridors where the fiber optic cables run, the Manta Ray provides the persistent monitoring layer that detects any approach by Guider combat divers or hull-mounted cable-cutting equipment before the operation is completed rather than after.
The intelligence picture that the Manta Ray provides about activity in the cable corridors, combined with the Lamprey's ability to track the Getter submarines that would deploy those combat divers, combined with the P-8's acoustic pattern of life database and the MH-60R's prosecution capability, creates a counter-cable threat architectures whose depth and layering addresses the operational problem from detection through interdiction, with the same systematic integration that the air defense suppression and targeting chain addresses the surface threat problem. The Iranian IRGC's identification of the cable threat as its next leverage instrument arrived at the moment when the American undersea warfare architecture was specifically being upgraded with the tools to address it. The Taiwan satellite espionage operations that were confirmed this week belong in the same analytical frame as the cable threat announcement because they are both manifestations of the same underlying strategic reality about the current global competition. 2 Chinese agents were caught setting up interception equipment near a French Starlink ground station, going after military satellite communications.
Norwegian authorities arrested a Chinese national attempting to steal sensitive satellite data. The NSA and 19 international partner agencies released a joint advisory warning that Chinese-linked hackers have been systematically targeting consumer devices to access adversarial military networks since 2021. China is picking NATO's digital locks while publicly positioning itself as a peacemaker on the Iran file. The Beijing summit produced a joint statement that Iran cannot have nuclear weapons and that the Strait of Hormuz must be open without toll payments. It also produced $17 billion in agricultural purchase commitments. It did not produce a Chinese commitment to stop the espionage operations against NATO allies that the joint advisory is warning about, or the covert weapon support to Iran that American intelligence has documented, or the satellite imagery provision to the IRGC that is among the Chinese covert support elements that the American Enterprise Institute's recent analysis confirmed. Different theater, same playbook.
The China that is agreeing in Beijing that Iran cannot have nuclear weapons is simultaneously running a full-core espionage operation against every NATO ally and providing the satellite reconnaissance that gives Iranian military planners the targeting information they need to conduct drone operations against UAE and Saudi infrastructure. The cable threat and the satellite espionage are both expressions of the same doctrine. Use every available asymmetric leverage point against the adversary's information and financial infrastructure, rather than competing conventionally where the adversary's superiority is undeniable. The Taiwanese F-16 that went down during training operations off Hualien this week, the PLA aircraft entering Taiwan's air defense identification zone simultaneously, and the Chinese drone swarm malfunction that revealed potential fractures in the People's Liberation Army Air Force's operational capabilities together constitute the Taiwan Theater Update that must be read alongside the Hormuz cable threat in the context of the simultaneous multi-domain pressure campaign that China is conducting. Taiwan remains the #1 strategic focus for Beijing in Xi Jinping's own framing during the Trump-Xi summit. The coordinated dual theater show-of-force carrier transit through the Taiwan Strait and naval task group in the Yakanai Channel near Japanese islands continues. The H-6 bombers carrying anti-H ship missiles flying over the carrier. The drone swarm malfunction revealing that even the most technically ambitious military programs have operational limits that their advocates do not always disclose publicly. All of this is happening simultaneously with the cable threat, the submarine operations, and the Truth Social post about delayed strikes and locked and loaded forces. The global complexity of May 19, 2026 is the specific strategic environment that China has been calculating its own moves in. Every American military asset committed to the Gulf theater is an asset not available for the Taiwan Strait. Every week the Hormuz crisis continues is a week that American strategic bandwidth is divided between the Gulf and the Pacific. The cable threat announcement is not just the IRGC's next leverage move, it is the next contribution to the multi-domain complexity calculation that adversaries across 2 theaters are making simultaneously. The 14-point Memorandum of Understanding that is reportedly being negotiated through the back channel is the diplomatic instrument against which all of this military and technical pressure is being applied, and its reported structure reveals exactly where the gap between the 2 sides currently sits. A 30-day negotiating window on the Strait of Hormuz, nuclear enrichment limits, sanctions relief. These are the reported framework elements. The core sticking point that the Iranian side cannot engage without the IRGC's institutional authorization is the nuclear question. The same nuclear question that was apparently absent from the formal Iranian proposal delivered through the Pakistani mediator. The same nuclear question that Galaba was removed from the negotiating team for attempting to engage. The same nuclear question that 2 sources have described as likely landing on a framework of 12-year enrichment suspension plus physical removal of the existing enriched uranium stockpile. And the same nuclear question that the cable threat announcement, the Gaudier operational posture, and the IRGC's continued strikes against Gulf infrastructure during the ceasefire are all serving as leverage to avoid engaging in a format that the IRGC can actually authorize the civilian diplomatic apparatus to deliver. Iran has converted its remaining military assets into the new version of what the shipping lane closure was supposed to be. The cable is the new oil tanker. The Gaudier is the new fast attack boat. The fee demand is the new toll booth. And the American response is the same in its structural logic. Build the architecture that denies the leverage. The P-8, the lamprey, The Manta array, the MH-60R targeting chain, the F-35s with JAMs overhead are the cable threat version of the carrier strike groups and A-10 Warthogs and Apache helicopters that address the surface and air versions of the same extortion doctrine. Trump's Truth Social post about the Gulf leaders asking for a delay is the specific diplomatic development on May 19th that separates this moment from every previous ceasefire extension and makes its potential significance greater than the pattern of previous Iranian delay tactics would suggest. Every previous extension was requested by Iranian-aligned mediators through channels whose neutrality was questionable. The Pakistani mediator channel has been producing proposals that verbally commit to nuclear concessions and then fail to include them in written documents. The dynamic of those previous extensions was Iran asks for more time, Iran gets more time. Iran uses the time to reconstitute military capability and avoid the concession. The process repeats. The current extension was requested by the Emir of Qatar, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and the President of the United Arab Emirates. These are not Iranian-aligned neutral mediators. These are the countries that have been absorbing Iranian missile and drone attacks, the countries whose energy infrastructure Iran has been targeting, the countries that are building F-35 fleets and Korean air defense systems and Israeli Iron Dome installations specifically to protect against Iranian attacks. They have no institutional interest in protecting Iranian negotiating delay. They have a direct material interest in a resolution that permanently ends the Iranian threat to the region's stability and energy infrastructure. When these leaders call Trump personally and ask him to delay strikes that were planned for today because they believe a deal is achievable, they are not acting as Iranian proxies managing the clock for the IRGC. They are acting as partners who have read the internal Iranian situation, absorbed the intelligence about the IRGC's financial desperation, assessed the material pressure of the blockade and the storage overclock clock, and concluded that the conditions for a genuine deal with the required nuclear provisions are present in a way they have not been previously. Whether their assessment is correct, whether the IRGC can actually authorize the written nuclear commitment that every previous verbal commitment has failed to deliver in document form, is the question whose answer the 48 to 72 hours of the delay will produce. But the identity of the people who asked for the delay is itself the most positive signal about the possibility of a genuine outcome that has appeared in this conflict, since the gift of the Strait opening that identified the right people to negotiate with. The locked and loaded qualification is the other half of the Truth Social post that requires equal analytical weight. Trump is not simply announcing a diplomatic pause. He is announcing a diplomatic pause with a military trigger attached. The U.S. military is locked and loaded should those talks break down. Every development in the last 72 hours, the Baraka nuclear plant drone strike, the formal proposal apparently omitting the nuclear question, the cable threat announcement, the military spokesperson's fee declaration, the Gadi Air submarine's continued operational posture, is a data point that the national security team's assessment of whether talks have broken down is incorporating. The 48 to 72-hour window is not open-ended diplomatic patience. It is the specific window that the Gulf state leaders identified as the timeline within which the deal can close or confirm that it cannot close. And if it confirms the latter, the locked and loaded force that was prepared to execute today is the force that executes when the confirmation arrives. The cable threat is the last asymmetric weapon the IRGC has publicly announced before the military option produces the outcome that the diplomatic option was supposed to provide. The Gadi Air submarines are the instrument through which that threat could be executed. The Lamprey and the Manta array and the P-8 and the MH-60R are the instruments through which that execution can be detected and interdicted. And the 48-hour window is the timeline within which the IRGC's next decision, authorize the nuclear written commitment that it has verbally made and not delivered, or execute the cable threat that announces its refusal to authorize it, will tell the world which of those instrument sets becomes operationally relevant first. Here is the complete picture of May 19, 2026, assembled from every dimension of what has converged in the last 24 hours. Trump posted that strikes planned for today have been delayed at the request of 3 Gulf state leaders who believe a deal is achievable that includes no nuclear weapons for Iran. The U.S. military is locked and loaded should talks break down. Iran's IRGC military spokesperson declared fees will be imposed on internet cables. State-linked media suggested cable companies refusing to comply could face direct or indirect damage. 7 fiber optic cables on the Strait of Hormuz seabed carry more than $10 trillion in daily financial transactions. Roughly 10 Gadi Air-class mini-submarines remain potentially operational with combat diver capability and the specific shallow water operational profile that makes cable cutting a feasible mission. The P-8 Poseidon is building the acoustic picture of every subsurface contact near Bandar Abbas and Kish Island. The MH-60R Seahawk is ready to prosecute any contact the P-8 detects. The Lockheed Martin Lamprey was unveiled 6 weeks before this conflict began, specifically for the shallow water mini-submarine environment. DARPA's Manta Ray provides seabed-level persistent monitoring of the cable corridors. China's agents were caught near a French Starlink ground station this week. A Taiwanese F-16 went down during training. PLA aircraft entered Taiwan's air defense identification zone. The Beijing summit produced joint statements and $17 billion in agricultural purchases without stopping Chinese satellite support to Iranian military operations. The storage tanks at Car Island are at 85%.
And filling at 3% per day. The IRGC payroll reserve is drawing down. The Supreme National Security Council's own internal document says unrest is inevitable, and only its timing is uncertain. The Supreme Leader communicates through motorcycle courier. Ghalibaf was removed. Jalili is positioned. The formal proposal apparently omitted the nuclear question. The Gulf state leaders asked Trump to pause.
Trump paused, and the clock is running on the pause in the same currency as everything else in this conflict. Not in hours of diplomatic patience, but in the specific operational readiness of a force that was prepared to execute yesterday and that remains locked and loaded today. The cable threat is the IRGC's last declared leverage before the pause either produces the written nuclear commitment or expires into the execution of the military option that the pause replaced for 48 hours. The lamprey is in the water. The Gadier is somewhere in the strait. The cables are on the floor between them. And the difference between the outcome where the cables remain intact and the outcome where they do not is being decided right now in the handwritten notes that a motorcycle courier is carrying to a burned and incapacitated man in a room that changes every night. Drop your analysis in the comments. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because the 48 hours after Trump's locked and loaded Truth Social post are the 48 hours that will tell you whether the Gulf state leaders read the internal Iranian situation correctly or whether the targeting chain from P8 to Lamprey to F-35 with JDAM becomes the operational reality that the diplomatic windows failure produces. The cables are on the floor, the submarine is in the water, and the pause is running.